Right. Even though this is a tiny room, I'm using a lapel mic because yesterday I lost my voice completely. So we may have to do the second half of this talk in a whisper. We'll see how that goes. So I decided to present today a set of data that is in its infancy for me. That is, I'm just starting to think it through. And I wanted to present it because it's very Southeast Asian in its flavor. It's sort of the most deep Buddhist studies of the stuff that I'm working on right now. So I have a framework for it, but I am hungry for any ideas about where I could take it, interesting directions or connections, because it's at an early stage of work. So today I'll be talking about mindfulness as a component of Buddhist practice. And we'll talk a little bit about what I mean by that and why I'm using it. Can you guys hear me okay? I feel like my voice is already disappearing. And I'll be talking about my project on pain in Thailand. And in particular, one of the things that I'll be addressing is the concept of an illness narrative. And I'm using this term not to mean the stories that people tell about their illnesses, but instead the stories that people have available to them of who to become and how to behave when they take on a new form of suffering or a new form of illness. So to structure this talk, I want you to imagine that you have just developed some condition that gives you severe pain, and you're living in Thailand. So the question is, what are the possible stories available to you about how this is going to go from here forward? So these are behaviors, identities, meanings that are getting structured in advance for people who are trying to make sense of what's happening for them. So why this is new work, so it's a very broad framework. It's just how I'm putting together the stuff for the talk. But it's useful for understanding the details of how something that seems universal or seems physical or seems biological manifests in very specific ways in different places, and also useful for helping people with their own pain by understanding what is possible for them moving forward. So as a practicing physician, I also run a pain clinic, and I'm thinking all the time about how to help people with their pain. So I want to draw from these narratives for practical things. So in Thailand, all of these narratives articulate in some way with Buddhism, and they tumble into issues of legitimacy. So who gets to claim that something is Buddhist or not Buddhist? What resources people have to access when they find themselves in a situation with pain? In what ways can they access the Buddhist clergy? In what ways are they relegated to accessing medical expertise? And so in a way, this is ultimately a question of how different forms of expertise, medicine and Buddhism and the Buddhist clergy, carve up the world about who owns what and who has something to say about what. So those are the broad questions. Since I'm talking about stories, we'll get into what I mean by stories and why I'm using that idea. But I want to start just by telling you some stories. And I want to argue that these aren't specific particular stories, but they are what Charles Hallisey and Anne Hansen wrote this article called On Narrative Sub-Ethics. These are stories that are not just particular to the people I'll tell you about, but are pervasive and structure people's understandings of what is possible for them. So the first story starts in the alleyway where I lived in 2015 with my wife and young daughter. We moved to Thailand to study pain. And at the mouth of our alleyway, this is a very common story in Thailand, was a noodle shop. It was fabulously delicious, and we ate there at least once a day. And all over the walls of this noodle shop, and this had nothing to do with me picking this place to live, all over the walls of the noodle shop were photographs of one particular Buddhist practitioner who had a rotten leg with metal equipment coming out of it, pasted all over the walls of this noodle shop. So this is not something that I went looking for. This is an image that was so pervasive that the owners of this noodle shop wanted to advertise it. So I started chasing down this story, and I went and I met this man, and also had a chance to interview all the people who own the noodle shop and why they cared about this. And here was his story. So this man, his name is Pa Cow, which just means Father White Robe. So it's he's an informal Buddhist practitioner, not an ordained monk. He's a lay person who has taken on a life of meditation. And he had been meditating in this form for maybe 10 years when he developed cancer of the bones, of the sort of outer layer of the bones of his leg. And it progressed very quickly and ate through a bunch of his tissue, and it was extraordinarily painful. And he went to the university hospital to be treated. And the oncologic group there said, we don't think we can treat this with chemotherapy, we have to amputate your leg. And they scheduled him for an amputation. The day there was that he was scheduled to have his amputation, he was waiting in the waiting room, and there was a big car accident outside the hospital in Chiang Mai. And all of the surgeons were swept away to do a whole bunch of emergency procedures, and they postponed his amputation. He went and talked to his Buddhist teacher, his spiritual teacher, and they both decided that this was a sign that he needed to not treat his pain and he needed to meditate his way through it until it killed him. So he never rescheduled the amputation, and he went and he started this process of meditating. This meditation he described as the most potent suffering that he could ever imagine any human experiencing, because the cancer just continued to progress, eat through different tissues of his leg. The metal pieces of equipment that they had initially put into his leg to stabilize it before the amputation started to migrate through his leg into different places, causing new and manifold forms of pain. And he eventually came to separate his mind from his body so much that his leg hurt, but he didn't hurt. He would use language just like that to talk about the leg as an object that was outside of his existence. And I want to play you a video of him, because the thing I want you to take away from this is just the difficulty of describing all of these intense things I'm talking about. And this video, obviously, he's speaking Thai. He's explaining to us his spiritual practice, how he went about this. But I want you to watch his facial expressions, his mood, his affect, his way of communicating, and also the way that he interacts with this leg as an object, as a teaching tool. I know that this is very disgusting and upsetting and that sort of thing, but that's part of where we're going with this, is thinking about things like disgust and upset. Okay.
เจ้าของขาของพ่อขาวรู้สึกปวดแทนเนี่ยจิตมันมายามากมันยาของจิตพลังอย่างเดียวนะที่พ่อขาวบอกถ้าไม่มีพลังไม่ได้หรอกพลังจิตนี่เดี๋ยวพ่อขาวอายุเท่าไหร่แล้วคะ56ยังก็แก่แล้ว56นี่นะมันไม่มีอะไรมันไม่รู้ถ้าถึงจุดนี้มันไม่ว่ามันจะห่วงอะไรอีกแล้วจิตที่มันจากคำสอนของ
So in this video, he has on prominent display two things that are paired together. When all of his Buddhist teachings, the leg is out front and center between him and his audience while he's teaching. And he has this beaming, very light smile and energy. And it's the pairing of those things that is the story he's telling as he talks about how his leg hurts, but he doesn't hurt. And he's demonstrating through these two things. So interviewing him about how this happened, that he was able to achieve this separation of his mind and his body such that his leg hurt and he didn't hurt, he emphasized a series of things that were essential to this process for him. The first was a particular kind of acceptance based on the wound as a karmic process that needs to be undergone in order to burn up karma from past experiences. And the way that I understand this is actually from the case of another patient who was a man with stomach cancer that I helped take care of for a while, who felt that his stomach cancer was a being from this life or from a past life that had come back to exact a retribution from him. And the phrase that he used for this was Jiao Gum Nai Wane. And it helps a little bit to break down those terms for a second. So Jiao Nai is the owner of something, or the master of something. And there's a term which is Wane Gum. Wane means to pay a toll or to pay off a debt. So Jiao Gum Nai Wane is a being from a past life or from this life that one has wronged in some way, that has come back to extract a toll and resolve that conflict. And the reason that there's a picture of a water buffalo on the screen is because Mahu, this man that I took care of, when I was interviewing about his stomach cancer, he had been in the hospital the week before. And he said, I discovered what my Jiao Gum Nai Wane was in the hospital because my whole life I took care of buffaloes. I raised buffalo. And I put a ring through their noses and I pulled them to direct their work. And when I was in the hospital, I had a nasal cannula. And every time I turned my head, it yanked on my nose, just like I yanked on the buffalo. And he said, I have a lot of pain in my hips and my knees, and it's because I've ridden buffalo my whole life. And he stood up and he had his legs bowed outward. And he said, so the buffalo has come back to exact a toll from me. And this was something, I don't usually think, when I'm taking care of Catholic patients, I don't usually think of being punished by God as a positive coping factor for people. But this was something that was a deeply meaningful thing for him that made his cancer a process that he was going through rather than something without beginning or end. So Pak Hao insisted that it was important to think of his pain as a Jiao Gum Nai Wane. But the most important thing, he said, was complete acceptance of the pain. So he said early in his process, while he was meditating, if any part of him, of his self, of his mind, wanted to take Tylenol, in Thailand that's paracetamol, wanted to take Tylenol to soften the pain, he would have horrifying suffering in that moment. So he had to completely reject any part of himself that wanted to treat it, because that part wanted it to go away and couldn't accept it fully. This is part of why he went from getting an amputation, very extreme intervention, to absolutely nothing at all. He wouldn't even take pain medications because they would obstruct the full acceptance of this Jiao Gum Nai Wane and the task ahead of him. So how did he do this? He talked about the process by which he separated mind and body was two key words. The first one is peng hen, which is a kind of repeated, penetrative, gazing poke of something in your sensory world. So he would do these very physical things where he would say, I take my mind and I look at the pain, and I look at the leg, and I just push my consciousness into it over and over and over again until I no longer want to run away from that experience. And he calls that peng hen, and he describes it very physically. The other word is pachern, which means to confront or face. And he would just also describe this very physically, where he would take his mind and he'd walk right up to the edge of the pain, where he felt like if he went past that, he would go absolutely insane and not be able to cope with it. So he would walk right up to the edge and then just stand there and face it until that edge got closer and closer to the pain. These are very, very vivid things. He's really only able to talk about them because of the materiality, the physicality of this wound that's sitting between him and you when he's teaching about it. The final thing that he emphasized, and I'll get to why I'm talking about all this in a moment, was that this process was horrible. It wasn't, oh, I'm doing this mindfulness thing, and therefore, I'm at one with my pain. He said this was the hardest thing he's ever done, the hardest thing he could imagine ever doing, and it got worse and worse and worse until, blam, his mind and body were totally separate. And his leg hurt and he didn't hurt. And this will become important in a moment. The reason I put up here the tortured path through samsara is that there's a phrase that I can't really find the origin of this. But in Buddhist studies, people often say samsara doesn't get better. Samsara is this world of rebirth and attachment to physical things, the nature of conditioned reality, meaning that the state of the mind is conditioned by the things around it. That is samsara, we're all in it. And the idea here is that it's all sort of all or nothing. You can either get out of samsara completely or you're in it. There's no such thing as samsara getting a little bit better by doing a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of practice, right? You can hear that this sounds very contrary to the forms of Buddhism that have arrived in the West and the kind of, recreational Buddhism that we all engage in. So I interviewed a monk who was a disciple of the first monk that I showed you, and he had really bad cervical spinal stenosis in his neck that was compressing the nerves of his neck for both of his arms. So he had severe pain in his arms, shooting electric pains down his arms. And he said he was gunning for enlightenment, or he wouldn't use that word, but he was gunning for this separation of mind and body. And he said that every day that he did it, this process, it got worse. The meditation process made the pain worse by focusing on it, living in it, going into it. Okay, so why am I talking about this story? I'm partly talking about it because I think that this set of narratives, this imaginary of what a monk can do, is a kind of legend that structures what's available to people who find themselves in pain. And in 2007, this is actually unrelated to this research, but I went to a conference that was attended by healthcare workers from every hospital in the whole country at the hospital accreditation required conference for the year. And the title of the conference was Culture and End-of-Life Care. And at the opening lecture, and this is a room full of 3,000 or 4,000 healthcare workers, they showed a video. And to open the video, they said, "This video is a legend. It's not a legend like the legends of the past, like the stories of the Buddha. It is a living legend of the present, and we have created it so that people will know what is possible." And I want to show you a little bit of this video. The video is about a woman named Supaporn who decided to meditate her way through an invasive breast cancer rather than receive treatment for it. And again, I want you to see the same components here. The showing of the really viscerally upsetting, painful wound and her experience of that wound at the same time as the key thing that they're showing in the video.
มันดีๆนะคะรู้สึกว่าใจมันมั่นคงขึ้นเรื่อยๆภาษาพระเขาบอกว่าใจมันเป็นกลางๆเป็นอุเบกขามากขึ้น
รอยยิ้มสดใสและความเบิกบานที่สัมผัสได้จากสุภาพรแทบไม่น่าเชื่อว่าเธอคือผู้ป่วยมะเร็งที่กำลังนับถอยหลังอาการในขณะนี้ก้อนเนื้อใหญ่ขึ้นมีน้ำเหลืองไหลออกมามะเร็งได้ลุกลามไปที่ต่อมน้ำเหลืองทับเส้นประสาทที่กระดูกสันหลังเกิดอาการลมติดทำให้เดินได้ยากขึ้น
ที่เนี่ยต้องทำความสะอาดก้อนทุกวันก็เป็นโอกาสดีที่จะได้พิจารณาว่าร่างกายมันเป็นอย่างนี้เองนะมันแสดงให้เราเห็นถึงความไม่แน่นอนถึงความเสื่อมสลายพี่โทรไปคุยกับเพื่อนพี่นะคะเขาบอก
So again, the goal of these visual images is to show something that is very shocking and shows the decay and destruction of the human body with this imagined experience that probably goes with it, contrasted to the actual experience of the person, to propose a pathway forward that involves separation of mind and body, and that the body can hurt, but the mind doesn't have to. So part of why I'm talking about this as narrative and legend is that this idea of narrative sub-ethics, that there are stories that live in the collective that pre-configure and structure and then rewrite after the fact people's actual experiences. And so everybody that I interviewed who had chronic pain, this story was proposed to them at some point in their experience as something that was possible, as a suggestion for a path forward. Now I want to talk about another narrative that shows up as a competing narrative, and here's where this is where my story starts to come together. And I'll tell you the story of Kun A, this man who had 4 years of very severe lower back pain. And he initially tried to treat it. He had 2 surgeries. After each of the surgeries, the back pain got worse. It got to the point where he could no longer, from pain, he could no longer walk very effectively. And when I was interviewing him, he said, I said, well, what did you try after those surgeries? And he said, well, the first thing I tried was Buddhism. We're going to talk in a second about what does Buddhism stand in for in a lot of these stories, and where are we going with that. And he said, Buddhist practice, he used the word bhatipat, the practice, made my pain much worse. And so instead, I had to go to the opposite of Buddhism. And I want to think a little bit about how can you, like, what's the opposite of a religion? Like, how can you even propose that as a thing, right? That's something that lots of people I talk to would say the opposite of Buddhism, and we'll get into what they mean by that. So let me tell you his story. He discovered that he didn't have pain, or that his pain didn't bother him, as long as he was distracting himself with something that involved taking care of other people. So he was a school teacher, and he noticed that while he was teaching a class, he didn't notice that he was in severe pain. He would forget about his pain. And then between periods, all the students would leave, and the pain would come rushing in on him like a giant wave until the next class came in and he would focus on them instead. So he decided to try distracting himself between class periods. So he would watch videos on his, on his phone or whatever, or he had little ways of distracting himself, and none of them worked unless they were focused on the students who had left the class or the students who were coming in next. So what he ended up doing was all of the students left their pencils for him, and he sharpened all of their pencils between class periods, and then gave them back to them later in the day. And that was his way that he could make it the entire day without noticing that he had severe pain. Another woman that I spent a lot of time with noticed a very similar thing, which was she again told this story that she tried Buddhism, and it made the pain worse. And her doctor said, well, what do you love doing? Is there something that you love doing that you could do all the time? And she said, I love karaoke, but I don't think you can do karaoke all the time. So she got a karaoke machine and tried singing karaoke by herself at home, and it did not work at all. So she initially found and then founded all of these karaoke groups in the city where I live, Chiang Mai. And she noticed that as long as she was either listening to somebody else sing karaoke or singing karaoke herself, she didn't notice that she had pain. And so she would go group to group and basically do this all day, singing karaoke. So when I think about narrative, I don't usually think about narrative this linearly. But it's interesting because most everyone that I interviewed with chronic severe pain told the same story, and they told it in the same order. And for me, that was this flag that there was a structuring narrative underneath what was possible for people to find a pathway through it, rather than, I don't know why I'm getting into a whole thing about how narrative is structured exactly, but it went in this order. A condition that causes pain, you try to solve it by fixing it medically. Eventually, people would realize that it was chronic and that it wasn't going to go away. They would try Buddhist practice as a source because they had learned from growing up that one of the definitions of the Fourfold Path in Buddhism is the promise of pain without suffering, that suffering is optional, but the things that happen to our physical bodies are universal. And it would not work for them. And there was always in this story a tale of a crash of disillusionment from Buddhism, and leaving the religion behind as a whole, saying, I don't go to temple anymore, all of that. Then there was a wave of acceptance, and we've talked about Jiao Gam Nam Wane. And then people developed these strategies of distraction and non-self, of focusing on others. So when I take this story and I take it to Po Khao, the teacher who's teaching about this, he says, is this really non-self that people are engaged in by focusing on singing karaoke with other people or sharpening somebody else's pencils? Or are they just avoiding reality? Is this just a form, is helping somebody else just the most extreme form of escapism? Is this really pain without suffering? Or are they just pathologically dissociating their minds? So you can see there's this talk back between these two stories about which one is a true path, about which one is legitimate, and there's a lot of concern in Buddhism about truth, because the idea of mindfulness is in the present moment, facing the truth of what is there and not running from it. That's the core offering of the mindfulness and concentration practices. So the question that I've been asking myself about this stuff, and I don't know yet whether this is the right question, and this is the kind of thing I want help with, is why are these two narratives immiscible? Why can't they be combined in creative ways? Why do people feel like they can only walk one path or the other, and that there's no, they can't go back and forth, there's no creative combination? What is it that keeps them separate? And the thing that comes to mind with this is the idea of strange attractors, which are a mathematical formula that were sort of core to the invention of chaos theory, which are equations that describe systems where it's very easy to inhabit one zone or another and almost impossible to be anywhere in between. That there's something very strong about each of the poles that pulls the path of this equation toward them. And the question is, what is that force that pulls these apart? And ultimately, what's the effect that has on the kinds of care that people receive and the legitimacy of that care? So, as we go forward, I want to propose a couple of ideas of why these paths are so divergent. And the first one has to do with the Buddhist concept and the Thai version of it, of the middle path. And the Pali for this is Machima Patipata, but most Thai people just use a very common phrase, Tang Sai Glang, which means to walk the middle, like a way between two things, a middle path. And I want to test this idea, I want to tell two stories. The first is of a woman named Kun Ann, who I knew sort of out of the context of my research, just socially, and she had very painful knees and was mostly a domestic worker and needed to use her knees a lot. But the way she described her pain was that it was partial. It was part of her consciousness and only part of her day. It wasn't there all the time, and it wasn't overwhelming when it was there. So she said, it's great. All I do is when the pain comes, I let it combine with whatever I'm experiencing, and I stay present to it. Okay? And I'm able to do that, she said. I just say, this is housework with pain, and I know it's not going to last forever, and I just do the housework with the pain, and then later when the pain's not there, I'm mindful of that thing that I'm doing next. Contrast that to a man named Kun Si, who again had very severe neuropathic pain. And neuropathic pain is a kind of pain that, if you have a certain flavor of it, never goes away because the nerve that is sending the signal for pain is broken and is just firing all the time. And his pain was so severe that it drowned out everything else. And he said to me, the reason I gave up on Buddhism was because of the teaching of the middle path. There was no middle path available to me. It was all or nothing, meaning he couldn't have a family, he couldn't talk to friends, there was no other thing that he could do in his life and stay focused on that thing because the pain took up too much of his, the way I think of it is kind of like your RAM on your computer. If your RAM is 99% full of pain, there's no room for anything else in life. And so the only options available to him were extreme renunciation of all things and focusing on pain until enlightenment, and that's it, or figuring out how to be distracted from it and ignore it and put it away somewhere. Another idea is, what if the problem with pain, and here you're seeing I'm playing with some ideas about this question, is a certain kind of pain a problem for Buddhism? Does it make these forms of practice less feasible and employable for people? And this man I call Kun E, and he had a motorcycle accident that led to the paralysis of his left arm. And the pain that he had, he described as blap blap, which in Thai translates to, I love that there's a word for this, it's the cracks that form in glass before the glass breaks. It's like a web type description. He also described it as pao ti pao, which means a cold that burns, that sets fire to things, a burning cold. And he had gone through this path, he meditated on it, he gave up on meditation, he had a way of distracting himself, all the things we're talking about. And at the end of my interview with him, I said, is there anything else that you'd like me to know about your pain and your experience of it? And he said, the only thing is, I find myself often wishing that I had cancer instead. And that was pretty wild for me to hear, and the first thing I said was, is that because you want to die? Because you want this to be over? And he said, no. If I had cancer and I knew that there was some end point to this, I knew that it was going to be finite, and I could go through a process that would have some meaning to it, it wouldn't just be endless, then I would know exactly what to do with this pain. And I want to take a moment to explore this a little bit, because cancer is a whole other narrative around pain in Thailand. And I came upon this narrative first when I was doing my work on end-of-life care, where Thailand actually has very high-tech hospital medicine. And more people, due to an aging demographic, dying of cancer instead of other things. And children owe their parents a debt of life for having been given a body at birth. This is sort of a complicated idea. I'm going on a little tangent here, but stick with me. Children owe their parents a debt of life for having been given a body at birth. And the best way to pay that debt right now in Thailand is seen as in the intensive care unit or with high-tech hospital medicine. So lots of elders who have cancer end up in the hospital at the end of life. And one family I was working with was able to draw me a table of how they were using the components of the hospital medicine to pay back the different components of the physical body for their elders, which gave me a sense of this process people were undergoing through high-tech medicine. But people also can't die at home. Can't die in the hospital. It's a bad idea to die in the hospital. And the reason is because the hospital is a polluted metaphysical space where there have been a lot of bad deaths and it's haunted by ghosts. And the opposite of this is the home, where the home is full of familiar things and familiar people. It has been the site of beneficial rituals for most of life, and it has accumulated all of that moral power that is constructed in this sort of Thai vision of the home as a moral space. It also has all of the familiar objects. So here's a woman on her deathbed at home, and around her head are gathered all of these bags full of her favorite objects so that she won't miss anything at the moment of death, won't cling to things of this world that would redirect her rebirth negatively. So what happens with this is people take their elders to the hospital for this relatively short process of paying back a debt of life, and then they rush them home at the last minute to make sure that the breath takes place in the right place, which is the home. I'm working on a book now called The Spirit Ambulance, which is this process, basically, of putting somebody in an ambulance and rushing them home. The problem with that is that since this sort of developed maybe 15, 20 years ago, this new object has emerged in the imaginary of Thai popular culture, which is the person dying in pain at home once they've been rushed home. So this process of getting somebody home and taking out their life support at home and having them pass away peacefully doesn't always go well. And instead, we've kept people alive, often on life support, for longer than they would be normally. Their cancer has advanced much further. And then here they are at home without all of that sedation and pain management. And so they often wake up in horrifying pain. And so this idea of pain at the end of life has become this massive object of focus for the Thai medical system, for the Buddhist clergy, who have come together and made videos sort of like the video we saw of Supaporn, who was meditating on her cancer. This idea that maybe the insertion of the hospital into this process isn't a good idea. All of this has created additional narratives of cancer as having a particularly meaningful spiritual process for the family, for the person who's dying. It needs to be caretaken, and the experience needs to happen in a very particular way. And this has ultimately led, I'm getting a little short on time, so I'm going to skip some of the stuff about opiates. But previously, there was opiate pain medications were not allowed outside of hospitals at all in Thailand. And this is actually a chart from a pain and policy research group at the University of Wisconsin that studies the use of opiates in different countries around the world. And the thing to notice about this is that, first of all, the US uses the most of anywhere in the world. There's one country that's higher, which I think is Sweden. And then this graph is divided by, so this is the amount of opiate per capita per year used. And this is not just, 2 times as much, 10 times as much. The difference between countries that use a lot of opiates and that use very little are somewhere between 4 and 6 orders of magnitude of difference of opiates. So Thailand is down in this part of the graph where you can't even see any bumps because the use of opiates is so small. And this imaginary of cancer, I'm not going to get into all the reasons right now of why this chart may look this way, but as a little preview, when I see a graph that says that rich countries use a lot of something and poor countries use a little of something, I immediately think maybe that thing is expensive. But morphine is the cheapest, earliest drug in all of the Western pharmacopoeia. So this chart has to have something to do with class and income, but not to do with cost exactly. So there are all sorts of things embedded in this, in the Thai approach to pain, which we're talking about right now, in the war on drugs and the politics of who gets access to things and how the war on drugs is fought around the world. But for Thailand, this has meant that the figure of cancer and pain at the end of life has been a huge controversy, because this imaginary of an elder person arriving home and then having a really bad death because of pain became something that everybody needed to intervene on. And there was a group of doctors who began illegally mixing morphine syrup and sending it home with people so that they could treat their pain and have their pain sort of follow this idea of the middle path, not too much pain at the end of life, but not ignoring it entirely. So the last 20 years have seen this story of cancer pain as a specific kind of pain that is different from these other kinds of pain, that is emerged as essentially a meaningful thing, that is a spiritual process that needs to be caretaken. And so if we think about cancer as a particular metaphor, there's a famous book by Susan Sontag called Illness's Metaphor, in which she talks about cancer as a concept. And in the West, it has often been seen as something that is totally meaningless, that is a form of rotten corruption of the body, and that a lot of the suffering of those with cancer in the West has been due to making sense of the meaninglessness of it or the stigma or shame attached to it. But in Thailand, we've developed this other thing, which is that cancer actually has a special status of more meaning, so that Kun A is basically saying, I wish I had cancer so that this pain would have some meaning for me. And that video with Supaporn, who's having her caseating necrotic wound on her chest treated and is being shown to us as a legend of something that is possible and meaningful and beautiful, is, for her cancer was a somewhat predictable walk through the impermanence of the body, the need for non-attachment to the physical being of this world, It was her chance to burn up some karma, to resolve this relationship with her Jiao Gumnai Wayne that needed resolving over time. And in that video, she uses this phrase that cancer, the mental shift with cancer is from crisis to opportunity, because there's something special about cancer that offers this pathway that you could walk and attain wisdom and learn more about yourself. Meanwhile, we're able to curate that process using pain medications in a way that we're not able to with other forms of pain. So the question I want to ask in this talk, and the reason I've gone through all of this about these different pathways that people have available to them, is there something about the pain of the people that I was studying, and in particular, is there something about the combination of chronic pain that is severe, that breaks all of these abilities to make meaning and find a pathway that is not so severe that it's almost inhuman to be able to trod. And the reason that I'm, focusing on that is because as a practitioner, a medical practitioner in the West, taking care of people who have pain, I can't get myself away from wanting to find things that are going to help people. And there has been a huge movement in the pain world in the United States to import Buddhism as a technology. And I haven't so explicitly in this talk gotten into what I mean by Buddhism, but it is a meaningful term when we talk about this importation, because people talk about we're importing Buddhism to deal with pain. The part of Buddhism that has been imported is the practice of mindfulness and concentration, which is exactly the thing that all of these people are telling me is like oil and water with the reality of existence. So here are all these famous books that, some of these actually, Mindfulness Meditation for Pain Relief, Mindfulness Over Chronic Pain. These are two textbooks that I was taught in one of my pain management courses for leading group classes on pain management here in the United States. And the idea is that samsara gets better in all of this. The core idea is that samsara gets better. If you have pain and you're mindful of it, you'll be less tense. You'll have less stress and anxiety. You'll do things differently. You'll have less pain, and the cycle goes onward. So that if you have a little bit of mindfulness and you sprinkle it on, you have a little bit less pain. If you have a lot of mindfulness, you have a lot less pain. But part of what these folks are saying is there's something about pain itself that fractures this technology, that makes this technology not actually possible for people in the real world. And then they're inventing a whole other set of practices that they are calling anti-Buddhism because they don't involve mindfulness and concentration. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. That's a lot. Those are my kind of initial, you can tell that my thinking about this set of data is still pretty raw. And so I would love to just hear reactions in general, but I'd also like to hear thoughts about ways to take this and framing about how this matters and is a little bit less of a messy telling of all these stories. And some possible framings that I've thought would be helpful for me would be to see whether you all think that this idea of the way that narratives structure care is a useful idea to expand on. It may be that people have written so much about narrative and narrative medicine and illness narratives that there's nothing particularly useful there. But for me, it helps explain how people end up shunted down these paths and feel like they can't get off of them. The other thing that I am working through, thinking about Pa Khao, this man who teaches with his leg, is the way in which this material wound is necessary for him to teach about this practice. And the way that the owner of the noodle shop described this to me about him was, he said, our whole life we've been having monks teach us about how you can escape pain and you can escape suffering through these practices. But always in the back of your mind is this doubt that maybe their pain and their suffering is not really like mine. And maybe it's not as bad, or maybe it's just different. But here's this leg, and the leg is like he said the leg is like a set of signposts to Bangkok. You just follow them all the way to the end of the destination. So there's something about the materiality of this wound that's able to bring all of these immaterial teachings that seems so abstract about the mind and practices of the mind into a concrete material reality. And then the final question that I can't decide whether it's interesting or useful or not, but it is for me in my practice, is this question of why particular forms of Buddhism travel and others don't, and how it was that mindfulness and concentration have come to be equated with Buddhist practice in the West, particularly with this idea of treating pain as the sort of vanguard of an in to most people being interested in Buddhism. And how is it that that is exactly the opposite of what people in Thailand are telling me about which subset of Buddhism should be most relevant? So I think I'll stop there and go with questions. And actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to record your Q&A session. So please use the mic, even if you think you're standing right in front of me.
I went to a lecture a little while ago, and somebody talked about mindfulness, the word mindfulness. And at the end of the lecture, I didn't know what that meant. And I've heard mindfulness a couple of other times, and I admit that I personally don't get involved in a lot of up-to-date stuff and all that kind of stuff. I don't watch a lot of television and that kind of stuff, or listen to gurus or that kind of stuff. But can you tell me exactly what is mindfulness?
Yeah. So there are two sort of most core parts of insight-based meditation practice, and they are mindfulness and concentration. And mindfulness is the idea of holding your mind present to what is happening in your sensory world at every moment, instead of letting it run away from them. It's actually a very concrete idea, but that's hard to, it sounds very abstract until you experiment with it a little bit, which is that the mind has this way of adding stories to things and wandering off on things, and there's a process in Thai Buddhism, in Buddhism in general, called dependent origination, which describes how suffering happens, which is that the mind gets sensory input from the world, and then it starts to do stuff to that sensory input. It says, this is pleasant, that's unpleasant, the pleasant stuff is good, I want more of that, the unpleasant stuff is bad, I want less of that. Maybe if I could do this, then the good stuff will happen more, and before long there's a whole story happening in the mind that's about sorting the world into things that are good for self and things that are not good for the self. And that's where the suffering happens. So the way to stop suffering is just to experience the sensory inputs and stop there. That's mindfulness.
Concentrate just concentrate on what's happening right now.
Yeah.
Oh, so it isn't the same as meditation then.
So meditation is a broad term that covers all sorts of stuff. You know, there's Christian meditation. Meditation in Thai Buddhism also covers lots of things, and they're not all mindfulness and they're not all concentration. In fact, there are some practices that involve intentionally filling the mind with positive things, like loving kindness for the world, for example. And then there are some practices that involve intentionally taking the mind and focusing on something, like a sound or an image, like a mantra that you say. And that's not exactly mindfulness, because you're artificially saying, now the mind is going to focus on the following thing. And I'm going to focus, and every time I get distracted, I'm going to bring it back, my mind, and focus on that thing over and over and over again to train the mind to be more focused.
No, when I first asked the question, you said there are two things, or one was focusing on only what's happening right now.
Yeah.
And not letting your mind wander.
Right.
And then the other thing was what?
Is concentration, which is learning to focus the mind more effectively.
Oh, so it's like an adjunct to the first.
Yeah, they're related, and there are particular meditation practices that do various combos of these things. Like, for example, if I focus on my breath and never let my mind leave my breath, it's both mindfulness, because my breathing is actually already happening. I'm not making it artificially happen. But it's also concentration, because I'm focusing on one thing and I'm concentrating my mind. Whereas if I say, okay, I'm going to intentionally say something over and over in my mind and concentrate on that, that's sort of more of concentration practice than a mindfulness practice.
Oh, like a repetition of something,
Yeah, like chanting or prayer or.
Oh, and then I don't know if this makes any sense, but so if you practice, or what is the intent of mindfulness then?
The intent of mindfulness.
The intent of mindfulness in relation to pain, for example.
The intent of mindfulness is the promise of having pain without suffering. The pain is a sensory input, but the suffering comes from not wanting to have the pain or thinking the pain is bad or being afraid of the pain.
So you concentrate on the pain then?
You concentrate on the pain and, concentrate on the pain and feel the pain without trying to go run away from it. Yeah.
Look,
I know, it's tough. Yeah. And then
Thanks for this. Was a very good talk. Yeah, I appreciate it. I was having the thought of image of a soldier in the field who is shot, has inflicted wounds himself, but is so concerned with his comrades that he kind of ignores what he's going through and attends to all the others there, and is able to proceed without allowing the pain to affect him. So that kind of, I associated that with the teacher, almost elevating yourself to a higher self and focusing, tuning into the needs of others as a method, as a way of dealing, coping with your own pain, and not necessarily experiencing the intensity of. So I wanted to see if that kind of is in line with that. Also, in terms of the different approaches, you had 3 different people there in terms of their experiences. So the person with the leg was approaching it in a slightly different way from, let's say, the teacher versus the woman with the cancer, breast cancer. If you could just go over a little bit, because I wasn't clear about the act of tuning out and avoidance. It didn't seem it was pathological, by the way, that there was a label there. Pathological would be something leading to a yeah.
So a quick summary of those 3 different stories of what's available are: there's the teacher who's sharpening the pencils, and for him, when he's sharpening the pencils, he forgets that he has pain. Mm-hmm. The monk with the leg, or the white-robed man with the leg, is saying that's an illusion and a false path, because the pain is really there the whole time, and you're going to come back to it eventually, and all you're doing is avoiding that reality. Mm-hmm. And so the true path, and this is where the legitimacy of what gets labeled a Buddhist Buddhism, what gets labeled Buddhism with a capital B, the true path would be to set aside all that distraction and just be in so much pain and accept the pain so fully that you become liberated from it, even accepting it and not trying to ignore it.
So he has the painful leg, but he doesn't feel pain.
Right.
He's able to detach from it.
Right, but he knows at all times that the leg hurts. He doesn't have to distract himself by sharpening pencils. So those are 2 paths. The third path is almost just an easier scenario in which doing the second path is made a little bit more possible, because there's this cancer is this thing that's easier to relate to, and it feels finite, and you can commit to it more easily and more totally than this pain that's going to be with you the rest of your life with no change. Is that helpful? Okay.
I don't know if you covered this, but I didn't get the part that time, as far as time, is there time, like how long did it take for the man with the leg to separate his mind from the from the pain, and the time, the woman, how long did this take? How long would it? And also, is there like research done that how many people, you gave us 3 examples of people, but how many more are there that is going through these practices and have, you know, successfully had that separation between mind and pain?
Yeah. So the question of time, people brought up a lot. And they brought it up mostly in terms of how difficult the task is and how prepared you are to do it. So Pak Hao, this man in the white robes with the rotting leg, had had a life 100% devoted to meditation practice like this for 15 or 20 years before any of this happened to him. And he often said, you know, it makes me think of, it makes me think of, there's an old quote from Glenn Gould, the pianist, that he just said that people were either talented at piano or not, and he would only teach people if they were already going to be a star. There was like no process by which you would get there. Is he sort of had this harsh, like, yeah, you kind of have to be many lifetimes into practice, and in this lifetime, many, many years into deep practice if you're going to do this successfully. So the other monk who kept saying, you know, this is making my pain worse and worse and worse and worse, and I'm hoping someday I'm going to crack through and separate mind and body, he was saying, oh, I just didn't have quite enough practice before this started to do it. The time from starting that kind of meditation to getting there, I didn't get a sense for how consistent that was or if people had much to say about it. Other than Pak Hao, he was sort of, once he made the decision and completely committed, he said it happened very quickly for him. Like months. Yeah. Yeah, he had all the foundational basics, and he'd also gone through a process. It wasn't months into the pain, it was months into deciding that this was his approach. So he'd already gone to that was when he'd already gone through the whole process of potentially having his leg amputated. Yeah, and you know, some of what all these people were saying is that, you know, and also your question of the numbers. So, you know, I wasn't doing a big quantitative comparative thing, and it would be hard to design that and know, you know, what population you're reaching at. But part of what I did is I started at a pain clinic, and that's a whole other story, the fact that there is a pain clinic in Thailand. And I interviewed people from there and recruited them sort of indiscriminately from there. And I would say maybe 5% or 10% had really decided that they wanted to try for this enlightenment style liberation. And then all the others had said, you know, I think that's possible. I think that's a thing. But I would have had to start lifetimes ago. There's no way I'm going to make it there in this lifetime. It's just like too high a mountain to climb to get there. That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and so the question is about whether to go that deeply into separating mind and body. Well, and it makes you wonder what you mean by danger, you know, what's going to happen. But for a lot of these people who started down that path and then said, whoa, that's not possible for me, the danger was that it was going to make their pain worse, which is, in their world, the worst danger possible would be to take this thing that you're trying to fix because it's so overwhelming and make it bigger and bigger through this process.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. But then my questions are around your opening statements. You talked about the explanatory model that you are using being based on what people have available to them. So I'm wondering whether it's completely what people have available to them or what they make out of that experience while they are in the experience. Yes, and I'm thinking it might be both. And this is based on two different scenario. One is a story of a movie that I watched, and then the other one from personal experience. So in apartheid South Africa, this lady was held captive somewhere, and she was being repeatedly raped. So it got to a stage where she said that she literally separated her body from her soul or her mind, such that every time she was being raped, it was just her body. She had to get to that level for her to be able to cope, and then she didn't die throughout the period, several years. And then so during that interview process, they asked her what was going on. She said each time the rapist was coming, she would separate her body from her mind, and then once the rapist left, she would take on her mind again. But then at that point in time of the interview, she said that her soul or her mind was still in that prison, that she hadn't gone back to take it. And that story really touched me. So literally she was telling us, or she's telling us, that it's only her body that is now existing in the present world, that she hadn't gone back to take her soul. Then I have this other one, which is like a personal experience. My mother was diagnosed with a pancreatic cancer. And at the initial stage, within the first few days, she was experiencing pains. And then on a certain morning when we went to see her in the hospital, she said she had had a vision. She was a Christian, that Jesus healed her in that vision. And from that moment until she went into coma and eventually died, all within 3 months, she kept telling us that she was no longer experiencing pains. She said she had no pains, but that she felt discomfort. So she only spoke of discomfort, but no more of pain. So I just think of how this might be based on her initial experience as a Christian, or what she made out of that illness. But then I don't know how you will react to these different experiences.
Yeah, so those are both really powerful and intense stories, and it makes me realize just a lot of problematic stuff about asking these questions that I'm asking and trying to figure them out, because you stumble really quickly into trying to make some normative claim about the human mind and how it's put together, and I know I'm playing in that space because I want to take care of people. I have a pain clinic and I'm trying to treat pain. So, but it just gets so problematic so quickly to figure out what the differences are between some of these things. So, like this monk's, we got to go back a ways here, but the fact that the monk would say, yeah. Yeah. It's actually the poster for a horror movie. Yeah, well, I have lots I can say about all those things, but this claim that maybe can't remember where I had it on a slide here. Middle path. Okay, here. How do you know what's the difference between pain without suffering, which is what you're talking about, and like a pathologic dissociation of the mind? I have no idea. It's sort of this, putting this talk together is the first time I've ever even thought about either of those things in comparison to each other, right? So the monk would say that the person who was sharpening the pencils was a form of delusion and illusion, because the only reason that was functioning was by ignoring the truth of reality, which is that there's pain there. So when the monk has, and I don't want in this work to be saying that the monastic vision of this is the right one, right? But the monastic vision is the one that's saying over and over again, everybody else is wrong, right? And the other people are saying, yeah, ours is wrong, because they've been taught that the monastic vision is real Buddhism. What they're doing is just ordinary life. But the monk would say that when he's sitting there with his leg, it hurts. His leg hurts. He doesn't hurt, but his leg hurts. So every signal of pain from the leg is coming, and he's receiving it. He just doesn't grab onto it. So, my guess is that if there's any reality in all of this, I have no idea where reality lies for people, but that there's some difference between that and deciding not to feel, or feeling totally disconnected from the body. It's not like he's turning down the signal he's getting from his leg. I'm now repeating his theory of how this all works, right? He's not turning down the signal, he's just not letting that signal turn into suffering when it gets into his mind. It's very hard to think about. Yeah. So he, right, he will, so he would say we all will pass away eventually. Any minute. In fact, the whole point is he's not thinking about anything other than what's right in the present moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm intrigued with your aspect of cultural narrative underlying on this and the approach. So it'd be very interesting for comparative purposes. One would think of Buddhism in Japan, for example, and how pain would it be any particular different from this Thai approach that you're talking about? And the narrative is essentially that you deserve what you have. And only through the acceptance of the fact that you do deserve what you have can you transcend it. Whereas the anti-Buddhism would seem to reject that.
Yeah. That all sounds like a more articulate version of what I was trying to say about that. The question is a little bit is about how, I think the guy who's sharpening his pencils would say that he's fully accepting that he deserves what he has. And yet he sees himself as on a completely different path from the monk who is really letting the pain into his heart at all times. And I just don't know what there is really just ultimately like a legitimacy question about how certain very ascetic monastic practices sort of win and get the label of Buddhist practice and teach everybody else that this totally beautiful thing they're doing of focusing on other people and distracting themselves and coping in their life that to me looks, from the outside, looks totally Buddhist. I mean, what do we even mean by Buddhist? How does it come to be called anti-Buddhist or a failed Buddhism? I think that's probably the heart of why I put all this stuff together and wanted to wonder about it is, how did you take this ultimately gorgeous thing of like the karaoke singer leading all these karaoke groups for other people with pain and, it's just fabulous stuff that's totally working for them, and how did they say that they had to leave Buddhism as a thing behind? Yeah. Oh, wait. Yeah, I don't know if... Yeah.
Path to enlightenment versus a different path in Buddhism, it has different...
Yeah, right. So, yeah, maybe there's something there about how this is the question was, is this... Maybe not everyone in Buddhism is on a path to enlightenment. Maybe there's a path to other things that are still Buddhist. Yeah.
So first, I'm sorry we're out of time. I'd like to thank you all for coming. Second, please don't leave without taking